In this video, I'll be demonstrating the magic loop method of knitting, where you're knitting a small circumference using a long single circular needle. So I'm knitting the sleeve, the ribbing for a sleeve on a top-down sweater, and I've got it on one long circular needle, and it's all the work sitting on the cable at the moment. And what I want to do is pinch out, it doesn't have to be exactly, but approximately halfway along the work, and I'll sort of pinch and split those stitches in like that and just pull the cable out. So now I've got the work and it looks like it's on roughly 2 halves, and I can see that the stitch that was just knit is on this this half. So I'm going to knit this half now. Now you never actually have to turn your work in terms of, you're never purling back or anything. You're always working on the outside, but you're going to work this half and then you're going to work the other half. So because I want to work these stitches, they're the ones that need to go on the needle. So I push them down ready to knit. So that's like my traditional left needle. And then I need to pull this out, and I can see the cable's getting smaller, so I don't want to pull it out too much, but I'm going to pull out the cable just enough so that I can use this as my right needle. Where people I think get a little bit unstuck is what to do with the yarn. So the yarn needs to be on, I'm knitting to start with, even though I'm ribbing, my first stitch is a knit. So the yarn needs to be behind this needle, but in front of the cable, because if I have it underneath the cable here, when I go to knit it, I'll end up with a loop over the cable. So just when you go to start a half a row, you make sure that the yarn is over the cable. So then I'm going to knit the first stitch, and I can see that the yarn isn't trapped around the cable at all. So I'll knit the first stitch. Now I'm ribbing, so I'll purl. And I'm going to knit and purl across to the other end of this half around. And you can see that I've got the other, so I'm going to finish here and then I'll have to turn. So I'm just going to pause and get towards the end. So I'm almost at the end of this half round. I've got 2 stitches left to work. Even though it doesn't matter where you stop, if I'm doing ribbing, I tend to like to finish on I like to have my first stitch on the other half being a knit. So I'm doing a 1 by 1 rib. So I've got a knit and a purl still to do. Knit and then purl. Now what happens is that needle becomes free, and I now want to knit the stitches that are on this cable, but obviously I have to get them off the cable and onto the needle. So what I do now is I turn the work around to knit the other half. So I'm going to knit the other half of the sleeve. You can see I've only got 1 round of ribbing done here. Here I've already got 2. So I need to do the other half. So I need to get these stitches, that's the stitch I just knit. I need to get these stitches onto the needle, and these stitches not off this end obviously, but down onto the cable so that I can start working with this needle. So I'll push that needle down. I generally try not to have both stitches on the needles, as in this half and this half on the needle at the same time. So I just push this one down a little bit to get ready, and then pull this one out a bit. And then once it's onto the cable, it's a little easier to get this one back onto the needle. So now I'm ready to knit the other half, and I want to make sure that that yarn, see I like to start with a knit stitch, so I've got a knit stitch ready. So I want the yarn behind the work but not under the cable. I want it over this way, so that, because if I had it sitting like that and then I go to knit, I'll end up with a loop over the cable, which you can accidentally treat like a stitch, and then you've ended up having 1 too many stitches and you've got a hole. So I put the yarn over the cable and pull this out a little bit so that the loop's getting a bit smaller, but not so much that I pull it out altogether. And then I pull that out and I'm inserting ready to knit. So I've still got a loop as long as it's there. Now, one tip that I do have, a lot of people talk about ending up with ladders when they do magic loop. And how that usually happens is if you want these two stitches to be, normally they would be right next to each other on the needle, but now they're sort of artificially far away from each other. So what you want to do to avoid ladders is to make sure that that stitch is actually which is on the cable, is quite close to the two needles together, ready when you first work this stitch. So what I do is I usually use my left hand to keep that cable actually quite close, at least when I knit the first stitch. So what you don't want to do is have your hand only on the needle and not on the cable. Can you see what I'm doing here? My hand's actually in the way and it's pushing this cable away from me. So then when I go to knit this one, I'm going to have a really big gap between this stitch and this stitch, and I don't want that. So what I do is I make sure that yarn's over the cable so it's not going to get in the way, and I put my hand, both in my left hand, I'm holding on to both the needle and the cable, and then I work the next stitch. Once you've worked snug it up, you can see see how that's quite close to the cable, which is where the other stitch is. So I've worked that stitch, now I need to purl. So at least for the first couple, I want to really make sure that that cable and that needle, they're quite close together. And then I don't really need to worry about it quite as much, but generally I am holding both the needle and the cable in my left hand. Right, I'll demonstrate that again when I get to the end of the round. So I'm almost at the complete end of the round. So I knitted across this half and then turned, and then I've knitted across this half, and I've just got to work those last couple of stitches. And I can tell that now I've done 2 rounds of ribbing on both sides, so I'm going to turn my work, get the yarn out of the way, and then I'm ready to start again. You might find it helpful to place a marker on the fabric at the start of your round so you don't think that you're at the end of the round when you're actually only halfway through. So if you put a marker here and you see the marker, that's especially helpful if you've got to knit a certain number of rounds, or if you're binding off and you bind off half of the stitches and then you cut the yarn and you've forgotten that you actually haven't bound off the other half. So it can be helpful to put a marker on this side just to sort of keep yourself on track. So what I do here now is I need this to be on the needle, so I'm just going to pull it up to where I'm about to put it on the needle. It will be easier to get on the needle if I start to pull this one out a little bit, but not too much, just until it's on the cable, and then push this onto the needle, get the yarn over, pull that needle out, but still keeping a loop, and then I'm ready to go with the next stitch. Just a reminder again, my hand is not pushing that cable away, it's hanging onto the cable next to, so that cable, which has that previous stitch on it, is right next to the next stitch. And I make sure that it's sort of snugged up until I've at least knit the first couple of stitches, and then I don't have to be quite so conscious anymore. So this is really useful. Magic Loop is great for small circumference knitting, even though you can use like 9 or 12-inch circulars. That doesn't really help you when you're, say, doing crown decreases for a hat, and eventually you're going to get down to, say, 16 8 or 8 stitches. You will need some other kind of method, so whether that's double pointed needles or Magic Loop. I just find I always lose a double pointed needle, and with Magic Loop I've only got one needle, so I'm less likely to lose anything. And that's it.